Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Inshallah, in today's class, we are going to take issue 3 in its entirety and about half of issue 4. Issue 3, we are going to talk about the different ways that a piece of hadith or a text of the hadith rather will be transmitted. So we're going to talk about what are the conditions for the narrator, what happens if somebody in the narrator that's above in the high in the chain denies what somebody lower in the chain says. We're going to talk about and learn about what happens when there are differences in the narration. So the same general piece or the same general hadith is narrated, but there are differences, what we call riwayat or recensions. One has an extra word here or an extra description there, one does not. Is that silence a damaging aspect of the hadith, or is it not a damaging aspect of the hadith? So obviously there will be details in that we will talk about. And then we will look at the words that are narrated. If there are words that have multiple meanings, how does the companion who narrated that hadith, how do they understand the meanings? Does that bear any weight in what we talk about? And then in issue number 4, we will talk about the conditions of narrations. Whom do we accept the narration from, and whom do we not accept the narrations from? So this is when we're going to get into the actual nuts and bolts of that. And does somebody have to be a knowledgeable person, a faqih, not a faqih? Do they have to have been known to spend time with a master of hadith or not? And then lastly, we're going to turn to the issue of adala or uprightness. And here I want to spend a little bit of time because he brings out a quality he says it's an internal, and I translate it as a natural talent. And I want to kind of talk a little bit about that and spend time talking about why that's important, because there are a lot of times we're stuck in like looking at the rules of things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and things like that, which is fine. But also we forget that there's an inner quality that is also important in our sciences and our disciplines. So we're going to talk about that inner quality of uprightness and what that means. And with that, we will conclude today's lecture, inshallah. So we'll begin the discussion in the next clip. See you soon. All right, so we'll begin the way we normally begin, which is to turn to the text. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين. Amin. Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. This is the issue number 3. المختار أن تكذيب الأصل الفرع وهو جازم لا يسقط مرويه. The chosen opinion is that if a higher authority in the chain of narrators denies a lower one in the chain, this does not negate the narration of the lower authority. Nor does it negate the uprightness either. لأنهما لو اجتمعا في شهادة لم ترد. And if both appear, their testimony is not negated. Okay, so this is basically that my sheikh comes and say, I did not tell Tariq this. Or I narrate a story from my sheikh and then my sheikh says, I didn't narrate that. Or I didn't tell him that. Now, on face value, prima facie, you would think, well, that is a damning thing, and there are instances where it could be damning. But the reason it's not damning is that it's not always a one-to-one relationship. Many times you are in the gathering in which you hear the sheikh narrate, and you have the right to narrate from the sheikh. I mean, I have many ijazat that come from that way, that you're in a gathering. I also equally have many ijazat where it's one-on-one, or me and like a colleague or 2 or 3 friends, and we go to visit a sheikh and we hear from him his chain of transmission. The sheikh could have gotten older, could have forgotten, etc. The basic assumption here, why this is the chosen opinion, which is a very beautiful kind of concept, is that no one would have the audacity to lie about the Prophet ﷺ, because not only is lying about the Prophet ﷺ, one shudders to even say that. Not only is it from the major sins, but which is a moral calamity of the highest proportions. May Allah Ta'ala protect us. But it is a cause for your narration and your testimony to not be accepted. It's as simple as that. So it's a technical point as well as a moral point. I'm not belittling the moral point. I'm just saying here in the science that we're talking about of narration, that if somebody is known to have lied about the Prophet aslan, to start out with, they're not going to be considered any at all for anything, neither for their narration nor their testimony, because there will be a known to be a liar, and we'll talk about lying in a moment. So the reason this is the chosen opinion is that each person is assuming that they are honest. So if they go to court and they're bearing testimony, they are basically saying, our understanding is that they are basically saying, I believe myself to be true. And, we take the Muslim's word at face value. So that does not negate the narration, nor does it negate the uprightness of the person. But if my sheikh comes and says, this is not, starts putting adillah that what I'm saying is not what he taught me or something like that, that's damning. That would take me away from the association with that sheikh. Here we're just talking about narrating the hadith. Okay. وزيادة العدل مقبولة إن لم يعلم اتحاد المجلس وإلا فالمختار المنع إن كان غيره لا يغفل مثلهم من مثلها عادة. An addition made by a reliable transmitter. An addition here like an additional description or aspect to the hadith. In yesterday's lecture I talked a little bit about that, how sometimes you'll find a collection of hadith that are saying the same thing, but there are slightly differences or different descriptions, additions and subtractions. So he says an addition made by a reliable narrator is accepted if it is not known that the gathering was singular. In other words, let's just make it simple. We're talking about the Sahaba narrating from the Prophet ﷺ. He said ﷺ many things many times. So like one of those examples, which is something that I talked about, I think it was yesterday's lecture or the one before, about the fast of Ashura, and how many of the Shia, actually all the Shia that I know, criticize the fast of Ashura. And one of the reasons they criticize it is they talk about the timings that the Prophet ﷺ entered in Medina on Rabi al-Awwal, where Ashura would have taken place already, and then the fast of Ramadan came. Or they'll criticize that Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu was one of the narrators, and I talked about that. So, but the fast of Ashura, what is unbeknown, and I don't mean to, this is not a polemic about Sunni and Shia, but I'm addressing this critique. The problem with that critique is, first of all, that there are other hadith narrated about the fast of Ashura that don't come from Ibn Abbas. As a matter of fact, the hadith al-Musalsal bi-Yawm Ashura, the hadith that is narrated in that you hear from the Shaykh on the day of Ashura, I can't remember the Sahabi right now, but it's not Ibn Abbas. It doesn't go back to Ibn Abbas to start out with. So there are other hadith and other catalogs of hadith in which other narrators narrated that. In other words, this is something that the Prophet ﷺ frequently talked about. Or not frequently, he talked about it in multiple times. It wasn't a one-off thing. So in that case, there can be additions here and there. Like one hadith talks about tawassu, expanding on the day of Ashura. Another hadith talks about the meritorious value of fasting on the day of Ashura. Another hadith talks about that this was the fast of Bani Israel and to celebrate Musa alayhi salam, etc. on the day of Ashura. So on and so on. And there are other weaker traditions about Noah finding land and Abraham being saved from the fire, Adam and Eve finding each other after being expelled from paradise, etc. on the day of Ashura. So we know that there are many times that the Prophet ﷺ said that, so there will be additions and subtractions in those narrations, and that's fine. But if we know that there is a one instance, like, I'm just making it up, but on the night of so-and-so, the Prophet ﷺ said such and such, well, that's a one-time thing, then we can start to say, well, that addition is a problem. So he says, an addition made by a reliable transmitter, and for us as Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, we believe all of the Sahaba are reliable and upright in their ability to transmit from the Prophet ﷺ. This is accepted if it is not known that the gathering was singular. If it is known that the gathering was singular, it is not accepted if in a typical situation another narrator would not typically be silent. So if it's not a singular gathering, we'll generally accept the addition, except in this case in which another narrator, reliable narrator, would not have dropped off that addition. So it's odd, why do you have that addition but everybody else doesn't have? Because that's something that's so pertinent to the text that anybody would have narrated that. In that case, we would consider that a dubious narration. So again, he says, if it is not known that the gathering was singular, it is not accepted, meaning the addition is not accepted, if in a typical situation another narrator would not have typically been silent, or if this addition is what would normally be transmitted. So, in other words, there's something so important to that text, that addition is so important, so fundamental, either to understanding the whole text or the context. A normal narrator would not have been silent with that addition. So when we find somebody that's silent, or when we find somebody that has often added something, but all of the other narrators are silent, but they wouldn't typically be silent with something like that, then that casts that into doubt. فإن كان الساكت أضبط أو صرح بنفيها على وجهه يقبل تعارضا. If the one silent is more reliable or clearly denies the extra portion, then both texts are in opposition. So we have text A, in which there is silence. We have text A in which there's an addition, and text B in which there is silence. The narrator of text B in silence is more reliable than the narrator of text A. So now we say both of these are in opposition, and then we are going to have to start to do tarjih. We're going to have to start, the hadith experts are going to have to start to prefer one over another. Basically arguing what we just said, well, the one that was silent, he was silent about an addition or a description or a part of the text that's so fundamental to the original text. There's no way that Ibn Abbas wouldn't have said that, or Abu Huraira wouldn't have mentioned that, or one of the Ummahat al-Mu'mineen alayhinna salam, one of the mothers, our mothers of the believers alayhinna salam, would be silent. That doesn't make any sense. It's too critical. So therefore that would be considered more reliable, and that addition would be considered spurious, and we would drop that addition. And that's another thing. It's not all or nothing. Sometimes we accept part of the hadith, or sometimes part of the hadith is more reliable than other parts of the hadith. That's what he's getting at. It's not a black and white thing. Oh, this is da'if. That idea of the black and whiteness of the hadith, sahih and da'if, that's a dichotomy that doesn't exist in the science of hadith. And it's one of the great calamities of the modern Muslim mind, that many Muslims, and unfortunately many Sharia students and ulama even, they think that. So it's not the case. As you can see, there's much more nuance. Which is why, my guess is why most people want it to be black and white, because it's just simpler. They don't want to exercise their minds to think at this level. Okay, well, let's pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. All right, and then he says, rahimahullah, وَالْأَصَحُ أَنَّهُ لَوْ رَوَاهَا مَرَّةً وَتَرَكَ أُخْرَى أو انفرد واحد عن واحد قبلت وأنه إن غيرت إعراب الثاني تعارضا. The dominant opinion is that if a narrator narrates it once, we're talking here about the addition, and leaves it another time, or is alone in narrating it, it is accepted. And the dominant opinion, if one narrator leaves out a key description in one narration, then there is an opposition to the narration. So here we have two scenarios. In the first scenario, we have one Sahabi, let's just say, or one narrator, let's just say Abu Huraira radiallahu anhu. This is completely made up. And Abu Huraira narrates a hadith about subject A, and in one narration he has an addition, and then in narration B and C he leaves out that addition. Abu Huraira is universally accepted, alhamdulillah, and he is alone in narrating A, B, and C. So therefore we accept versions A, B, and C. Naturally, somebody like Abu Huraira radiallahu anhu would have not narrated the hadith to the tabi'een or to the other Sahaba, because sometimes the older Sahaba narrate to the younger Sahaba just once in their life. So it is feasible and conceivable that he would have said the same story multiple times, as we ourselves tell. My wife always tells me that I'm repeating myself. I'm saying the same stories all over the time. It's natural human behavior. That's another thing that we forget, is that the narrators of hadith don't narrate the hadith just once to the person that heard it. Because we read it in the book, we're assuming that the narrator only said it once. No, they might have said this 55 times in their life. And they had many majalis of the listening of hadith. I myself have attended many different majalis of the same book of hadith. Sometimes the same hadith itself, like the hadith al-musalsal bil-awwaliyya, of the first hadith. I've heard it, 20, 30, 40 times, alhamdulillah, and counting. So it is conceivable in my theoretical example that somebody like Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu narrated the same story or the same text one to A, B, and C 3 times, but in version A he had an addition, in versions B and C he did not. He's reliable, he alone has narrated the story, therefore we accept that addition that has been added. However, that's scenario 1. Scenario 2, he says, and let me just read it again. In the dominant opinion, if one narrator leaves out a key description in one narration, then there is opposition in the narration. But if that description, that addition is critical, then there is a problem. Those hadith A that has the description and B and C that don't have the description, now these two texts are in opposition. One of the examples that he gives, which is important, is the hadith about the ocean. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Huwa tuhurun ma'uhu al-hillu maytatuhu." This is narrated in Abu Dawood radiallahu anhu. The ocean, the Prophet ﷺ said, its water is pure and the dead in it are halal to eat. Those are two independent statements related to the ocean but are not relying on one another. So for example, if somebody narrated, and I don't have this knowledge right now as I'm recording, so let's just assume it's theoretical. If one narrator you find in a book, al-bahr tuhurun ma'uhu, that's it. The ocean, its water is pure. And then later in that book or another book you find another author would say, the bahr, the ocean, al-hillu maytatuhu, it's dead, the carrion in it are halal to eat. Those two texts relate to the ocean, but they're not in opposition to each other, they add to one another. That's fine. Here, he's talking about in scenario number 2, the addition that has been added is a critical piece of information. It's critical to the text itself. Like in the hadith of Qullatayn, if somebody narrated that hadith without the word Qullatayn, well, the whole hadith is based on Qullatayn. The whole concept of the water for us as Shafi'is, about, well, not just as Shafi'is, in Islamic law in general, that there is a certain amount of water after which that amount, it would take, as we say in English, an act of God to change the quality of the water such that it would not be pure and purifying. There'd have to be like this massive oil spill or, catastrophic environmental catastrophe, disaster for the water not to be tahir. So if like a little child goes into the ocean and urinates, no faqih is going to say, that you can't make wudu with that water. So the key is the word qullatayn, or that quality. Now there's differences in opinion amongst the different madhahib about how much water, but the idea is qullatayn is a key qualitative description necessary to understand that text. So if you were to find that text narrated without the word qullatayn, he's saying, but then elsewhere qullatayn, then the non-qullatayn narration and the qullatayn narration put together are now in opposition because there's a quality that is needed to understand them. In that case, we have a problem. Okay, he says, rahimahullah, next, وأن حذف بعض الخبر جائز إلا أن يتعلق به الباقي. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. In the dominant opinion, leaving part of the statement is accepted, except if it is contingent on the rest of the text. So, the hadith of the bahr that we just mentioned, if we were talking about carrion, al-mayta, in fiqh class, and I said, the mayta is haram, except the mayta of the bahr, al-bahr, maytatuhu, al-hillu maytatuhu. And I just cited that part of the hadith. I knowingly and willingly dropped the first part of the hadith. So he's saying in that context it's permissible because the first part of that hadith is not necessary to understand the second part of the hadith. And in the class, when I'm making istidlal, when I'm calling for the dalil to prove my point, I don't need the first half of the hadith. So it's common that you would shorten the textual evidence in the classroom. When you write, it's different. When you write, now we have like footnotes, and in the old times we had hawashi. That's like, so let me just show you, like in my book that I'm using, this is above, you see a line, you see the line here, above the line, this is the method that we're studying, and I'm translating. This is Shaykh al-Islam's commentary, and then on the bottom, you see that you have all these footnotes, hawashi. So any hadith that's mentioned somewhere in the text, most likely in the hashi on the bottom, in the footnotes, or in the old books, I don't have an old version with me, on the side, on the margins, the marginalia, will be the full reference. That's fine when you write. But when you talk and you teach like this, it's common that you would drop it. So he says, in the dominant opinion, leaving part of the statement is accepted if it is not contingent, often, if it is not contingent on the rest of the text. Except if it is, sorry, I misread my own translation. The dominant opinion is that leaving part of the statement is accepted, except if it is contingent on the rest of the text. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَلَوْ أَسْنَدَ وَأَرْسَلُوا أَوْ رَفَعَ أَوْ وَقَفُوا فَكَالزِّيَادَةِ. If the text is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ by one, marfu'a, or to a companion, radiallahu anhum, by another, but not by name, or attributed to the text, or attributed the text to the Prophet ﷺ, or attributed to a companion by another, then it is like the extra narration previously mentioned. And we said when we studied hadith that anything that's going to a companion it takes the ruling of the marfu'a, it takes the ruling of the hadith that's connected to the Prophet ﷺ, because how would the companion say something from their own volition? I mean, that's what it means to be a Muslim. It means to be a Muslim is that we respect the Sahaba in their ability to effectively, accurately communicate and transmit the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If you didn't believe in that, then the whole edifice of Islam comes crumbling down. So that's a necessary belief that's just so fundamental. Sometimes we don't even talk about it because it's like saying I need air. A human being needs oxygen to breathe, well, obviously, or else we wouldn't be here talking. So if one narration, the hadith ends at like Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhum, but in the same, another Sahabi narrates that all the way back to the Prophet ﷺ, that addition is like the additions that we're talking about. There's nothing wrong with that addition, and there's no opposition, because Ibn Abbas wouldn't have said something from his own self. He said it because he heard it from Rasulullah ﷺ, especially when it has things to do with belief, aqidah, things to do with the end of time, eschatology, because there's no rational way to understand those things except from the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay, we'll pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. Okay, and then he says, rahimahullah, وَإِذَا حَمَلَ صَحَابِيٌّ مَرْوِيَّهُ على أحد محمليه حمل عليه إن تنافيا وإلا فالكالمشترك في حمله على معنييه فإن حمله على غير ظاهره حمل على ظاهره في الأصح. So if a companion radiallahu anhu expresses a meaning to something that contain multiple meanings, we follow his interpretation if both meanings are appropriate. So one word has multiple meanings. Sometimes we call that a homograph, like the word bark. It could be like the bark of a tree or the bark of a dog, something like that. So we have many words like that in Arabic. We call them in mushtarak. It looks the same, but it has different meanings. So if a companion is narrating such a word and expresses a preference for one, and both interpretations are correct, we follow the interpretation of the companion. Otherwise, it is like the mushtarak, one word having multiple meanings. If the companion interprets the text not on its apparent meaning, we follow the apparent meaning in the dominant opinion. So the default, al-asl, the way we understand words is to take the prima facie meaning of the literal meanings of the words, unless there is a problem with the literal meaning, which requires us to have a metaphorical meaning. That's just a principle of Islam, and definitely a principle of the Shafi'i madhab, as documented by Imam al-Suyuti rahimahullah in Ashbah al-Nadha'ir, a book that I've referenced frequently because it's like basically a manual to understand the madhab. So in that case, we would default to the prima facie meaning of the word, unless there's a reason, Unless there's a reason, like all the theological issues, like the hand of Allah, the throne of Allah, Allah ala al-arsh istawa, all those things cannot literally mean what the literal meaning means because it's not befitting of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay. Issue number 4. لا يقبل مختل وكافر وكذا صبي في الأصح. A narrator is not accepted who is not of sound mind or is a disbeliever. So not of sound mind either permanently or temporarily. Temporarily if they come back, then they come back. But there are all types of medical illnesses that would qualify for not of a sound mind or a disbeliever. So a disbeliever, even if they're live a morally upright life, they cannot. That type of narration about from the Prophet ﷺ is not accepted. Likewise, a young person in the dominant opinion. والأصح أنه يقبل صبي تحمل فبلغ فأدى. But a young person who narrated young and grew older and narrated is accepted. So a young person that is below the age of puberty, their default narration is not going to be accepted. But if that young child grew up past puberty and then narrated what they were narrating when they were younger, now that they are upright and mukallaf, that is accepted. ومبتدع يحرم الكذب وليس بداعية ولا يكفر ببدعته. We accept the narration. I lost my place, one second. We accept the narration of a person of innovation, of bid'ah, or reprehensible innovation to be more accurate, who holds lying to be prohibited, but not if he calls to his innovation or his innovation leads to disbelief. So there's a lot going on there. So the person of bid'ah that engages in bid'ah or believes in something that's a belief of bid'ah, you accept their narration with the following caveats. Number 1, the most important, is they believe that lying is haram. And the reason he mentions that is that there are many people of bid'ah, unfortunately, who just lie. It's like bid'ah in religious matters, that is. It's ironic, right? That these people call to the Quran and Sunnah, but they are liars, So, unfortunately, the only way that people of bid'ah can sustain their bid'ah is through lying. I just hate to be blunt, but that's just accurate. In our system, we make mistakes, but because of the principles that we follow, i.e. the principles of Usul al Fiqh, which is our interpretive principles, we are transparent. And if I make a mistake, I have no choice but to acknowledge that I made a mistake and ask Allah Ta'ala for forgiveness and ask you for your forgiveness and try to do better next time. But if I were to be stubborn and cover my mistake, that means I'm on the path of lying. I'm also on the path of bid'ah. In my experience, most people of bid'ah, there's a version of them that are extremely ignorant and just they've been fooled. I see that. But the people that are out there, there's a percentage of lying, unfortunately, that happens. I'm saying a general statement. When I deal with people on a one-to-one basis, or specific people, I give them the husn al-dhan, inshallah, and I assume good. But I'm explaining to you what he's writing. Unfortunately, it goes hand in hand. There are people, few, but there are people that really just have a fundamental belief of bid'ah, but no, lying is haram. So if that's the case, we accept their narration. Another caveat is that if they don't call to their bid'ah, and that's another problem. People of bid'ah oftentimes call to their bid'ah. That's what defines them. They are defined as, in Arabic we say بِضِدِّهَا تُعْرَفُ الْأَشْيَاء. By opposites, things are known. So the people of bid'ah, they want to be known, and wanting to be known means they call to their bid'ah. And number 3, also very important, is that the bid'ah does not necessarily lead to disbelief. This brings up another concept that we have in Islam, which is lazimul madhab, that which is necessarily derived from a school. And the qa'ida, the principle that we have is lazimul madhab laysa bimadhab, that which is necessarily derived from a way of thinking is not necessarily from that way of thinking, except if it is a automatic conclusion. So just because someone has a belief of bid'ah, and if you sat with them and you 1, 2, 3 steps later, you show them that their bid'ah leads to kufr, leads to disbelief, that is not a bid'ah that leads automatically to kufr, because there are a couple of steps. But if it is a bid'ah that is, if somebody says, absolutely, I believe that Allah is a big form, limited in the sky, you know, sitting on a chair. I mean, that's disbelief. That's anthropomorphism 101. That's completely that is a bid'ah of disbelief. That type of bid'ah is almost, it's just a polite way of saying disbelief, I guess you could say. So you can't accept that person's narration. Okay, and then he says, وَمَنْ لَيْسَ فَقِيهًا وَإِنْ خَالَفَ الْقِيَاسِ وَمُتَسَاهِلٌ فِي غَيْرِ الْحَدِيثِ. We also accept the narration of people that are not jurists, so you don't have to be like super scholar to be able to do that, even if they go against analogy, even if their arguments are against qiyas, and this is in opposition to Imam Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu, as well as a person who is loose in narrating social events but strict in narrating from the Prophet. Social events, yeah, I caught a fish this big, we say in English. Obviously, there's no fish that's this big in the local rivers and water sources. So you're just any loose with that. But when it comes to Rasulullah, you start sweating and like, no, exactly. What is the hadith? What's the exact wording? They have an exactitude when it comes to the Prophet ta'ziman in Nabi. So they honor the Prophet. In that case, we accept their narrations. ويقبل مكثر وإن ندرت مخالطته للمحدثين إن أمكن تحصيل ذلك القدر في ذلك الزمن. Accepted is if the person, we also accept a narrator who has much narration, even if not known to spend much time with the masters of hadith, if it is possible in that small time that they would have narrated that much. And then he says, وشرط الراوي العدالة وهي ملكة تمنع اغتراف الكبائر وصغائر وصغائر الخصة كسرق لقمة ورذائل المباحة كبول بطريق. And then he says, the condition of the narrator is uprightness, and uprightness is defined as a natural talent. Malika, it's a malaka, it's something that's a natural talent on the inside to stay away from the major sins and lowly minor sins like stealing a morsel of food and bad habits that are permissible like urinating and standing. So the upright person, he or she is not going to do any of these things because it's just naturally, why would I do that? Why would I steal something, a grape from a windowsill or a pie? Like in the old American examples, you're baking a pie and then they put it on the windowsill so it can cool, so it smells. So like, you're playing in the yard, so you grab a piece of pie. Right? You're not going to do that because it's an unmanly, unwomanly thing to do. But that only comes from a disposition on the inside. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to talk about that, so I'll pick up the next class to pick up on this issue. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Okay, alhamdulillah, in today's class we did all of issue number 3 and about half of issue number 4. So we talked about discrepancies in the chain of transmission. Somebody above the chain, the sheikh denies that he narrated to the student. We talked about that situation. Then we talked about additions and subtractions. We spent a lot of time talking about additions and subtractions in narrations. And we said that as a default, the addition and subtraction is not a problem if the addition is not necessary to understand the whole, or if it was not known that the gathering was a singular gathering, and if there are other people that didn't narrate that special quality, and that special quality is something that they naturally would have reported on, in which case your addition, if you're the one narrating it, is a little bit dubious. Why did you have that extra piece and the other people didn't? Because it's such an important piece. So we talked a little bit about the complications of that and how it's not black and white. And we talked about essentially you can accept part of a text and deny part of it, or say that part of a text is sound and part of the text is weak. We talked about whether the hadith goes back to a companion or back to the Prophet ﷺ. That's like the additions that we're talking about that are permissible. We said that you can narrate part of a text and not narrate the other parts as long as the other parts are not necessary for the part that you narrated to be understood. And then we talked about issue number 4, and we started talking about whom we accept the narrations from. The person has to be of sound mind, they have to be a believer. We talked about the problems of disbelief, the problems of being young, and we spent quite a bit of time, maybe more than I had originally wanted to, about bid'ah, talking about the conditions from accepting a narration from mubtada. That the person of bid'ah is accepted if their bid'ah if they hold that lying is haram, and if they do not openly call to their bid'ah, because we're not going to be their narration, then it's a conflict of interest, and especially if what they're narrating has to do with their bid'ah, that's something that's not in the text but part of the commentary, I forgot to mention. So if somebody has a bid'ah belief about Allah Ta'ala and is narrating a hadith about that false belief, well, it's a conflict of interest. You can't accept that hadith, even if they hold lying is haram. And also if their bid'ah necessarily leads to disbelief, which I talked about. Then we talked about, we accept the hadith, the narration of a non-jurist or a non-hadith master, etc. And then we ended by talking about al-adala, or uprightness, which I didn't get much time to talk about, but we'll do that in the next lecture, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.